The circle of fifths chord progression is one of the coolest chord progressions around. There are some videos that already exist which talk about this chord progression, but I feel like there's a lot more depth to it that hasn't really been discussed. Also, I really just need an excuse to ramble about TikTok trends of yesteryear.
Hey, what do you think of this?
So first, let's talk about the namesake of the circle progression, the circle of fifths. I've referenced this many times throughout my previous videos because it's pretty much the backbone of Western music theory. Essentially, the circle of fifths is a method of arranging all 12 notes in the Western chromatic scale into a sequence such that every adjacent note on the circle is equidistant, spaced out 5 steps from its neighbor. This pattern forms a perfect loop. There are so many reasons why this pattern is important. One of the main reasons is that this shows common relationships between chords. The Western ear likes to hear chords resolving down a fifth, and the circle of fifths organizes the notes into that order. One of the most common resolutions in Western music is what's called the 5-1, the chord that starts on the fifth note of the scale, resolving down a fifth to the chord that starts on the first scale degree. Often, this chord is preceded by the 2 chord, which itself is up a fifth from the 5 chord, giving us 2 consecutive downwards fifth movements. The Super Mario World Game Over jingle is a perfect example of this. This 2-5-1 is a comfy sequence of chords that helps to establish that last chord as our key center. The happy stability of that fifth movement makes this resolution so satisfying. So logically, it would be even more satisfying if we took this pattern backwards by 1 more chord, turning it into a 4 chord progression: 6-2-5-1. This chord progression slaps. The 4 chord nature of this makes it a great chord progression for music centered around 2 or 4 measure phrases, which is what's most common in the West. Take for instance Weezer's Island in the Sun.
When you're on a holiday, you can't find the words to say.
Or The Feels by Twice.
You have stolen my heart, oh yeah. Never let it go, oh oh. No, never let it go, oh oh oh. Lightning straight to my heart, oh yeah. I got the feels for sure, yeah. I got the feels for yeah.
Or Break the Targets from Super Smash Bros. Melee. These last 2 examples added some funny chords, but usually, these 4 chords are all diatonic, meaning we're not borrowing anything from outside of the key. Analyzing the chords, we start with the 6, which is the minor tonic, but then we have the aforementioned 2-5-1 ending on the major tonic. Starting on the 6 minor but ending on the 1 major gives us a little bit of wiggle room to the tonality, allowing for the progression to easily take us to a more minor vibe, or as it usually does, remain more major. It's also a very stable chord progression because it's bookended by these 2 tonics. There's honestly a lot of harmonic implications and takeaways to this movement, especially in the context of classical and jazz music, but really the most important thing is that this tumbling down in fifths feels good and intuitive to the Western ear. But these 4 chords are really only half of the true circle progression. Oh, hey you, 6-2-5-1 or double it and give it to the next person.
My new jeans.
Let's continue this pattern downwards from our 1 chord. We end up at the 4, but then after that we're at a crossroads. If we go down another fifth, that takes us to a note that isn't in the scale. The closest thing would be the 7, but if we do that we would have to break the pattern and go down a diminished fifth instead of the usual perfect fifth. This is usually what happens though, for a few reasons. Keeping everything with diatonic roots allows us to cycle through only chords within our key, which keeps the listener grounded in this longer chord progression. Also, in doing this jump to the other side of the circle of fifths, you can see how we can close the loop much faster, rather than having to meander our way through 12 different chords. So after the 7, we can go down another fifth to the 3, and then finally 1 more fifth back to the 6, closing the loop and successfully using every single diatonic chord. Which is actually pretty rare for a chord progression. Let's take a listen to these chords in the circle progression order. just has so much color. Similar to the anime canon, it takes a whole journey throughout so many different colors of chords, feeling a bit major here and a bit minor there. I would argue this chord progression is overall heard in minor, albeit a pretty bright minor. As such, let's change the Roman numerals to reflect that. There is one last change we have to make, so it matches the version that is heard most commonly. The penultimate chord is usually a 5 dominant 7, which gives a stronger 5-1 resolution compared to just having the 5 minor going to the 1. Let's take a listen to both. With this, we now have an almost perfect symmetry to the chord progression. If we split it in half and analyze the first half as major, we can see that the chord progression is just a 6-2-5-1 in major, and then a 6-2-5-1 in minor. I love this chord progression. I'm sure when I played it just now, you thought of a tune that sounds like this. Just like the anime canon, this chord progression has transcended genre. Despite originating in the classical world, it's actually quite common in jazz, modern pop, video game soundtracks, and many other things. But unlike the anime canon, both how and why circle progression is used can greatly vary. So let's talk about some of the textbook examples first. Fly Me to the Moon uses the exact form without any variation.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
In this tune, the chord progression is used because it sounds good. Notice how the melody loosely follows the movement of the bass. The fifth movement slowly moves our bass notes downwards, and the melody sticks to the bass, matching that downwards movement. This is a huge trend in songs with circle progression, and in fact, many of them take this concept even further. Let's take a look at Luxurious Overture from Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Looking at the melody, we can see how it's literally the exact same thing copied and pasted every 2 measures, just transposed downwards. This is called sequence, a classical music term for when a melody or motif is repeated throughout a section, but continuously transposed lower or higher. This is of course done to contour to the pattern of the chord movement. The intervals between the melody and the bass remain consistent every time it repeats. This creates the effect of locking the listener into this chain of resolution. As soon as we hear both the bass and the melody following the same pattern, we can almost finish the entire melodic phrase in our head, and the music has the choice of either cathartically confirming this or surprisingly subverting this. This was probably used here because it's idiomatic to the gothic, Castlevania-esque setting of the game. Because both circle progression and melodic sequence are so common in Baroque-era music, it's almost a complete cliché at this point. But that allows composers to insert such a concentrated Baroque sound into a piece by using this technique. But there's also the opposite of this, where the melody defies the movement of the chords and stays consistent over the constantly jumping bass. Let's look at Love You Like a Love Song by Selena Gomez.
I love you like a love song, baby. I love you like a love song, baby. I love you like a love song, baby. And I keep hitting repeat, beat, 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 beat.
Instead of sequence, the melody is just the exact same thing 2.5 times in a row, before it has to bail itself out at the end to not have yucky notes over the 2 minor 7 flat 5. This repetition creates an interesting effect where we have consistently changing intervals between the melody and the bass. Look at the I syllable at the beginning of each 2 measure section. The distance between E and C sharp in the bass is a third. Then 2 measures later we have E and B, which is a fourth, and then E and A, which is a fifth. Having consistently different intervals every 2 bars creates little micro tensions, especially in this measure, where the E on the downbeat is not a chord tone of B major. Also, the melody as a whole staying mostly the same while the bass meanders its way down creates oblique movement, which is just where one part moves while another doesn't. The melody and bass slowly separate, which also creates a bit of tension. But speaking of tension, this chord progression is also commonly reharmonized in some specific places to maximize variation of the chords and increase the harmonic flavor. The most common reharm can be heard in the first chord of this Fullmetal Alchemist opening.
君の手で
also appears in one of my favorite places, the opening theme for the TV show Narcos.
Tu el aire que respiro yo y en la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que se moja, que temo ahogar de amor.
In both of these, that first chord is reharmonized as major, in a dominant 7 in fact. Doing this accomplishes so many things. Most importantly, that first chord now acts as the related 5 of the next chord, rather than just the minor tonic. We feel a strong attractive force pulling us into that next chord, which itself wants to go to the next chord, which then wants to resolve to the major tonic. This chain of dominant, subdominant, dominant, tonic is not only stronger than tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, but it also gives us a nice pattern of a strong major chord every 2 measures, which can then of course be used as a nice platform for sequence in the melody. And in both of these examples, we can see how the melody does adhere to a sequence. In the Narcos theme, we can even see how the melody immediately highlights that identifying major third of our initial dominant chord, giving no ambiguity to that more powerful sound. And one final thing about this reharm is that it delays the final resolution to our minor tonic until the very end. Since we now hear that first chord as just a vehicle that drives us to the next chord, the chord progression is just one long sequence that sets up a payoff at the end of the 8 chords, which also creates a loop with more harmonic variation, since we don't need to repeat that minor tonic at both the beginning and end of the loop. This concept of not wanting to repeat the same chord will come up again in a second. But first, I want to talk about another really spicy reharm of the progression. This time we're looking at the final cue heard in the last episode of Succession. So this cue starts with a pretty standard circle progression, but with an ascending melodic sequence, which is pretty cool. But here, instead of going to the usual 2 minor 7 flat 5, we go to the saucier flat 2 major, which then goes to an inverted 1 minor, then a 5 sus, which resolves to a more powerful 5 at the end of the cycle. So let's back up a little bit and analyze that flat 2 using the circle of fifths. Usually, after the flat 6, we would break the perfect 5th movement to set up an eventual return to the 1 minor. But instead, we defer that break, going down another 5th into the super colorful and non-diatonic flat 2. In classical music, this chord is called the Neapolitan chord and is used to set up the 5 chord. In this context, though, the 5 itself is also deferred. That inverted 1 minor doesn't feel like our minor tonic. The top voices slightly fall into that suspended 5 chord, which resolves the suspension into the 5. Let's take a listen to that last section. There's just so much juicy classical tension here. Notice how we never even get the usual resolution to that 1 minor at the end of the loop. We're essentially hanging on that 5 chord for twice as long, which slowly gets more intense across those 2 measures. In doing all of this, we still keep the same semicircle shape of the progression, but just tilt it slightly on its axis. Nicholas Britell is just a great composer. I tried watching Succession for the music, but my short-form media brain can't handle slow burn dramas. Alright, so in terms of the usual circle progression, I saved my favorite example for last. Virtual Insanity pushes that standard progression to its absolute limit. Let's take a bit of a listen.
And I'm giving all my love to this world, only to be told I can't see, I can't breathe, no more will we be. And nothing's gonna change the way we live, 'cause we can always take but never give. And now that things are changing for the worse, see, wow!
So first, we have another variation of the pattern break happening here. The usual jump across the circle of fifths happens on chord 6, whereas Succession pushed it to chord 7, Virtual Insanity moves it up earlier to chord 5. We land on the 6 minor 7 flat 5, which then, rather than continuing down a 5th, goes down a minor 2nd to the diatonic flat 6. This of course breaks the pattern again, but it's diatonic and it goes down again a second to the expected 5, so we kind of just hear that flat 6 as just an acceptable substitute for that too. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this tune is what happens after the 5. The circle progression, and by extension our set of diatonic chords, only has 7 chords to work with. But most Western music adheres to phrases of 2, 4, or 8 measures, essentially just powers of 2. What that means is, every example we've seen thus far has to repeat one of the chords, which is usually the 1 chord at the end of the loop. But virtual insanity presents perhaps the most elegant solution to the problem. It just removes the last measure of the phrase altogether, giving us 1 chord per measure and a 7-measure phrase that perfectly connects the 5 into the 1 from the next phrase. That first measure of the phrase simultaneously feels like the last measure of the previous loop and the first measure of the new loop, which is just so damn cool.
And I'm giving all my love to this world, only to be told I can't see, I can't breathe, no more will we be. And nothing's gonna change the way we live, cause we can always take but never give. And now that things are changing for the worse, see, wow.
What I love about this is, whereas it feels like sometimes in other circle progression tunes, you can hear the composer struggling with the discrepancy between the 8-measure phrase and 7 unique chords, this 7-bar phrase just feels like an intuitive result of JK's lyrical and melodic writing. Looking at the lyrics, we can see how that last line of the phrase connects to both lines before and after. The word be at the end slant rhymes with breathe, but the and of the next line serves to connect the 2 lines together as one sentence. So cool! It's another great example of music's strength as a temporal art form. We can play with listener expectations and subvert them, but still make them hear the same snippet as 2 different ideas, depending on if they hear it forwards while it's playing, or retroactively after it passes and is recontextualized. The cool thing is, this doesn't even happen every single time, only every other phrase, otherwise being given the usual repeat of the minor tonic at the end of the expected 8-bar phrase. This keeps the 7-bar phrase fresh, and even sometimes makes the expected 8-bar phrase actually feel like the subversion instead. Alright, so what else could we even talk about when it comes to this progression? We've already seen reharms, different contexts, and phrase length alterations, but there's still one more thing you can do that, despite being somewhat common, is actually rarely talked about. Since the progression is a closed, relatively stable loop, it allows us to do something that almost never happens in any other chord progression. What happens if we keep all the same chords and chord functions, but start at a different point in the loop? The most common variation of the standard circle progression structure chops off the first minor tonic and plonks it at the end, which actually makes a lot of sense, because now the 1 can hang for a bit longer at the end of the loop and have some time to breathe. What this now means is that we can now start the loop on the 2-5-1 of the major tonic, which in many cases is actually more palatable and expected. Definitely one of the most common examples of this variation appears in a quintessential jazz standard that was at some point every first semester's ringtone at Berklee, Autumn Leaves. Dude, Autumn Leaves sucks. Wanna play something else? Yay! Guys, I'm sorry, I hate Autumn Leaves. Let's listen to the more appropriately Zoomer example, My Ordinary Life by The Living Tombstone.
Staying still, eyes closed, let the world just pass me by. Pain pills, nice clothes, if I fall I think I'll fly.
That's better. As we can see, even though the chords move by very quickly, this follows pretty much the exact thing we were talking about. We start on the 4 and cycle down until we land on the 1. One thing of note about this is that, at least to me, this variation of the progression feels a tad brighter than the standard one, not starting with the minor tonic and instead actually having the 2-5-1 of the major tonic in the beginning helps to make the progression less dark, or at the very least more flexible. Let's look at some more variations of this structure. One really unique variant that I only found one instance of is the famous first movement of Vivaldi's Winter. So now we're starting on the 5, 1 chord backwards in the standard loop, if we're not counting that extra 1 minor. This is pretty interesting. It's pretty uncommon to have the 5 at the start of a chord progression, but this accomplishes so many things. In the cycle down, we end up on the 5 chord again, just like we end up on the 1 chord again in the standard cycle. Ending on this 5 sets up a resolution to the 1 chord, which is exactly what happens afterwards. This of course breaks our circle progression. This variation is used well when it's used exactly once. It would feel kind of weird to end on the 5 and loop back around to the 5 again, because the 5 isn't as stable as the 1. It instead just wants to resolve to the 1 on the strong beat of the next phrase. I kind of skimmed over talking about the Baroque origins of circle progression earlier, but Vivaldi's pretty much solely responsible for this progression being as ubiquitous as it still is. This dude committed to the bit for all 63 years of his life, and especially as a violinist, I have to respect it. Alright, so there's pretty much one final variation I could find. What if we start on that flat 6 and tumble our way down until we land on the major tonic? As you can see, it's actually our only variation that compellingly feels kind of major, since we end on the 2-5-1 of our major tonic, so let's change those Roman numerals accordingly. Rhythm Heaven Fever has an example that showcases this almost perfectly. Let's take a look.
Let's spread our wings now, do anything now. Somehow we came this far. Okay.
So this pretty much follows the exact structure of this variation except for this chord. We should have the 7 minor 7 flat 5 to keep the 5th movement, but the 5 just feels much better, especially after the 4. These beginning 4 chords also form the so-called Royal Road chord progression, pretty much the most common chord progression if you're a J-rock musician. Or Rick Astley.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down.
But anyways, after this, we have the expected cycle down until we land on our 1 chord. But after the 1, we get a cute little 1-7, or in this context, 5 of 4, which not only maintains our harmonic rhythm of 1 chord every 2 beats, but also serves as the dominant chord that connects the end of the loop back to the beginning. So, frustratingly, despite being a banger tune, this doesn't quite have that 5th movement required of circle progression, and every tune that almost follows this pattern breaks it by adding that 5 in place of the 7, or otherwise changing other things. The only example I could find that follows the pattern exactly is this one TikTok, which doesn't really count because it's kind of more of a piano exercise than a song, but just take a listen anyways. And that's pretty much all there is to it. There are many other examples of different circle progressions, even some that I didn't get a chance to talk about, such as 50 Ways to Say Goodbye by Train, or After Like by Ive, which I guess I referenced in the beginning. Also, I'm certain there exist other variations of the progression, such as one that starts on 1 major, but I just couldn't find any examples. So as always, please post in the comments any examples you guys know about. And with that, I guess we're done. I do feel a bit weird having called this circle progression the entire time, since it really does resemble more of a semicircle. Unfortunately though, my efforts to change the nomenclature have all been for naught. Aw, dang it.